Cái người diễn giả thứ hai này là một trường hợp khá đặc biệt. Ông là một người Mỹ gốc Đức và đã từng làm phóng viên chiến trường tại Việt Nam trong vòng 5 năm, từ năm 1965 đến năm 1970, và đã sát cánh với các cánh quân đơn vị Việt Nam Cộng Hòa trên khắp 4 vùng chiến thuật, và có thể nói đã thấu hiểu cái hoàn cảnh của chúng ta nhiều nhất. Ngày hôm nay, vị giáo sư này đến với chúng ta để nói lên một khía cạnh, một cách nhìn mới về cái chiến tranh Việt Nam, khác với lối nhìn thiền cận của đa số truyền thông Mỹ đối với cuộc chiến tại Việt Nam. Giáo sư Siemon-Netto đến với chúng ta để khẳng định một điều là chúng ta hoàn toàn có chính nghĩa. Quân lực Việt Nam Cộng Hòa đã chịu, và nghĩa vật của chúng ta đã để lại một gia tài tinh thần cho các thế hệ mai sau, hiểu được các cha ông, các đàn anh đã sống và chiến đấu như thế nào cho Tổ quốc và lý tưởng tự do. Chúng tôi xin mời nha sĩ Lê Hoàng Quỳnh Châu, người bạn thân của giáo sư, lên để giới thiệu vài hàng về giáo sư.
Thêm là giáo sư Siemon-Netto, hiện tại là Executive Director của The Center for Lutheran Theology và Public Life at Capistrano Beach, California. Và ông và người vợ gốc Anh của ông là bà Jillian hiện tại có nhà riêng tại Pháp Quốc và tại Laguna Woods, California. Xin cảm ơn quý vị. Dr. Siemon-Netto, welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm immensely flattered to have been asked to speak to you almost half a century after I first arrived in Vietnam as a West German war correspondent. I apologize that I am not addressing you in Vietnamese. I do have a Vietnamese translation of my speech here today, but you'd be laughing me out of this room if you heard my accent. So I had the option of saying it in German. I don't think too many of you would understand it, or in French, so I said I'd do it in English. As a German, of course, I was, as a German journalist at the time, I was particularly interested in the Vietnam story because, like Vietnam, our country was divided into a communist and into a democratic part. So we were keen followers of what was going on in Vietnam, and I'm saying this ahead of what I will say later. Fortunately, Germany reunified in a manner that I could have wished for Vietnam to reunify. And I do hope that eventually your country will be reunified as a free nation again. I arrived before the American combat forces landed in Da Nang. This was in 1965. It was then that I developed a passionate love for your country and its people, who honor us Germans by calling us, here's my mispronunciation, Dick, which means also virtues. One day, a member of a band of homeless newspaper boys living in the streets, on Tudor Street, approached me and said, "You're Dick, my name is Dick, so we're both Dick, and I have a deal for you." So, he said, "If you allow my friends and me to sleep in your car, we'll protect and clean it for you." I'd rented on a semi-permanent basis, those of you who know in French cars, a wonderful machine, a Citroën 15 chevaux, a traction. It was huge and very thirsty, and was built the year I was born in 1936. Its door locks had long gone, so it was just as well somebody watched over it. Sometimes 7 or 8 children slept in this machine, and I promise you, keeping it immaculately clean. I always parked my car on Tudo, opposite the Continental Palace where I lived, right next to the Café Gibral. You remember Gibral? It became more just a means of transportation for me. More importantly, it became a means of friendship for two Dukes. Duk, the newspaperman, and Duk, the head of a bunch of kids, who were itinerant vendors of the Saigon Daily News and Saigon Post and other newspapers that were sold in Saigon. And on and off this friendship lasted until my traction became a casualty of the Tet Offensive in 1968, and the kids disappeared from Tudo for a while. I wonder what might have happened to Dick since then. Perhaps he is living here in the United States. He might be in his room, who knows? It would be wonderful to speak and laugh with him again, and we had many good laughters together. He was just a marvelous kid. Not that I spent that much time in Saigon, I often accompanied your troops into battle. And there I observed Arvin doctors and medics intrepidly trying to save the lives of wounded men. Perhaps some of you and I have met in Quang Tri, Pleiku, Hue, Plainy, Nha Trang, the Mekong Delta, or at the POW camp on Phu Quoc Island. All this was in early 1968. Later that year, I compacted my spine when an American medevac chopper I traveled on was shot down west of An Khe. And so American doctors looked after me, but never mind the nationality. I greatly came to appreciate the sacrifice, courage, and professional skills of all of you, Americans, Vietnamese, Koreans, or Australians. You were magnificent, and I was there for 5 years to testify to that. So perhaps you and I might have met. I was hard to miss when I visited your units, for during those early stages of the war, I was often the only West German correspondent in South Vietnam, and my badge identified me as a German. For one brief moment, I became your comrade in arms by capturing a Viet Cong. This was actually quite amusing, and here's what happened. In February of 1965, I attached myself to an American Special Forces A-team and participated in a parachute exercise west of My Tho. I hit the ground, I rolled up my chute, and noticed that the ground gave under my feet, under the weight of my feet. Suddenly I sank into the ground. I stepped back, the surface popped up again. I hopped on it, and forcefully, and that's what, and the surface sank, and then I heard a groan. And again I stepped back and removed a layer of grass and discovered the camouflage plastic helmet of a VC and a nozzle of an M1 rifle. First I lifted the gun out of the hole, then the VC. He was a slim little guy in black pajamas, and he was shivering. And I told him in French, "Courage, camarade, pour toi la guerre est finie." For you, the war is over. I don't know if he spoke French or not, but he surely understood what I was saying, namely that the guerre was over. And now he smiled. Lucky man, he probably survived. I turned the VC and the rifle over to the Americans, who then, of course, turned over to the Vietnamese units. but kept the plastic helmet as a trophy. So for the next 46 years, it lived in my library until my friend Dr. Cui Van Lee and his wife Zhao came to my house in France last October. So I gave the helmet to them as a souvenir. Not that I performed a great heroic deed, but nonetheless I was glad to help out. So here's the helmet. It's genuine, plastic, Viet Cong camouflage. I don't know who made the plastic, but it's yours.
Is that okay? Do you hear me better now? This is the helmet. Look. Thank you. And it is now a gift to you in your museum. You can admire my trophy for as long as it lives. And as I said, it's been there for 46 years. Now, this was a benign incident whose memory I cherish. A few weeks later, I had a distressing experience west of Nha Trang. But it was significant for my understanding of my assignment as a war correspondent, for it showed me the true face of the Vietnam War. The reason why I am going to elaborate on this event is that it illustrates why so many Americans never quite grasped what this conflict was all about. President Richard M. Nixon later cited my report about this incident in his book, The Real War. So pardon my vanity if I quote a United States president quoting me. Nixon wrote, German journalist Uwe Siemon-Netto provided a vivid illustration of how communist guerrilla groups use terrorism to effect their purpose. Siemon-Netto, who accompanied the South Vietnamese battalion to a large village the Viet Cong had raided in 1965, reported, dangling from the trees and poles in the village square were the village chief, his wife, and their 12 children. The Viet Cong had ordered everyone in the village to witness this family first being tortured and then hanged. Mutilated and then hanged. Mutilated while they were alive. They started with the baby, then slowly worked their way up to the elder children, to the wife, and finally to the chief himself. All this was done very coolly, as much an act of war as firing an anti-aircraft gun. All these were Nixon's excerpts from a story of mine. Nixon explained that this is how the communists won the hearts and minds of the rural population. They did not win hearts and minds by acts of compassion, but by the most merciless form of intimidation. The villagers told me that the Viet Cong cadre, or a Viet Cong cadre, had entered the village several times before and warned the chief, obviously came at night, and warned the chief to stop cooperating with the South Vietnamese government, lest there be severe consequences. But he remained loyal. So they returned in the middle of the night and woke everyone in the village to witness the massacre, during which the propaganda officer told the people, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't join us. Remember that. I am ashamed to say that I no longer recall the name of that village. I've seen so much and had so many in so many places in Saigon and Vietnam. But that doesn't really matter, because this sort of thing went on all over South Vietnam every night back then. Yet the American public was largely unaware of this, because their media did not tell them. In the daily press briefings in Saigon, the infamous 5 o'clock follies, episodes like this were reduced to a mere statistic. The briefers would routinely inform correspondents of a huge number of incidents, and I'm making that in quotation marks, incidents that occurred in the previous 24 hours. This sounded like this, like a sales report. I-Corps, 184 enemy incidents. 2-Corps, 360 enemy incidents. 3-Corps, 225. 4-Corps, 480. That was that. No details were released and revealed, or hardly ever. That would have been impossible, humanly impossible, given the large number of these kinds of incidents every 24 hours. We journalists had no way of researching all these particulars unless we stumbled into such an event as I did when I accompanied a battalion of what I believe was the 22nd Division, Argon Division. Yet what I saw there near Nha Trang was actually enormously significant because it represented the essence of this particular stage of guerrilla warfare. Acts of terrorism to cower the civilian population were characteristic of what was called the second phase of guerrilla warfare, a strategy developed by General Vo Nguyen Giap, the defense minister of North Vietnam. I seriously doubt that so many Americans would have turned against the Vietnam War had their media continuously described these acts of inhumanity that occurred everywhere in South Vietnam. But they didn't, partly because journalists did not have the means to do so, partly also because many reporters and editors simply had a different agenda. I said many, and I hasten to add, not all. 3 years later, during the Tet Offensive in Hue, I stood with my colleague Peter Braystrop of the Washington Post at the rim of a mass grave and overheard him ask an American television cameraman, "Why don't you film this scene?" And he answered, "We are not here to spread anti-communist propaganda." This showed a shameful mindset of many of my colleagues, a mindset that I believe was instrumental in shaping the desire of the American public to end this war at almost any cost. General Giap knew what was going to happen. He knew that American voters would tire of this war, for he knew the weaknesses of a free society all too well, notably its short attention span. 60 years ago, Giap wrote, "The enemy," meaning in reality always the democracies, "does not possess the psychological and political means to fight a long, drawn-out war." He prophesied war fatigue, the peace movement, the hypocritical inclination of ideologues to overlook the hideous nature of a totalitarian revolutionary movement, the inclination to accentuate shortcomings of one's own side, the allegedly corrupt nature of the allies democratic societies are sacrificing their young men for, in this particular case, the South Vietnamese government, and eventually the desire to seek, I say this in quotation marks, to seek an honorable way out, and in quotation mark again, peace with honor, and an equitably negotiated settlement. Let me tell you, add to my text here, that I covered the Paris peace talks in 1968 and was fully aware of how dishonest these talks were and how hypocritical. What was so remarkable about the media's role in Vietnam was that some American correspondents who later became strong anti-war advocates were well aware of this danger. On January 13, 1965, the celebrated American columnist and historian Stanley Carno quoted Jupp's statements about the inability of free countries to fight protracted wars and warned his readers about the consequences of this dire flaw in the fiber of any democratic system. And yet before long, the same Stanley Carno led the pack of writers agitating for a so-called peace with honor, of which he very well knew it was unobtainable, not with honor. Today, we hear echoes of this with respect to Afghanistan. I would like to add here, this morning, we heard in the news and read in the papers, an attack resembling to some extent the Viet Cong teleoffensive, an attack on the diplomatic quarter of Kabul, the liberation, quotation marks, of Taliban prisoners from Pakistan's jail. So there are parallels there. Again, we hear calls for a negotiated settlement. We hear about secret talks between the United States and the Taliban. No thought is given to what compromise this totalitarian movement could be expected to stick to. What would such a compromise entail? That instead of being forbidden to learn how to read and write, women would be allowed to learn only half the alphabet? That for the first 5 years after the Taliban takeover, only half as many alleged adulteresses would be stoned to death or hanged, as is the norm, or was the norm before the Taliban were driven from power. That women would receive only half as many lashes if they were caught showing their ankles under their chadors, or if their shoes were clacking. A dozen years ago, the leading American feminist group, the National Organization of Women, published dramatic accounts of the Taliban's past ghastly human rights abuse against women on this website. Today, it wastes no thought on the high probability that these abuses will be repeated once NATO has withdrawn its forces, because these abuses are as much inherent in the ideology of radical Islamists as gulags were inherent in communist ideology in Vietnam, the Soviet Union, China, and elsewhere. Those of you who experienced communist internment camps after 1975 know whereof I speak. I believe that all of you have a mission to be witnesses and continue to be witnesses to history. We must keep the memory of historical truths alive for the benefit of those who follow us. We must keep reminding the media in our host countries of their pivotal role in the preservation of freedom. We must warn those who come after us of the dreadful consequences of bad journalism, academic hypocrisy, and a bored electorate's lack of resolve. You are in the best position to do this. You've seen and often suffered so much, and you must keep this memory alive. Let me add something here. I'm a Christian and an amateur historian. As a Christian, I know who is the ultimate Lord of history. And as an amateur historian, I know that history is always open to the future. Nothing is a given as it appears now, or will be this way 20, 30, 40, or even 10 years from now, or even 1 year from now. Putting these two factors together gives us hope. Hope for Vietnam, hope for Afghanistan, hope for mankind. We are not the masters of the future, but we have a calling to contribute to making this a better future. Therefore, we have not seen great evil deeds in vain, nor have we suffered gratuitously. There is a reason for all this, and the reason is that we are able to tell future generations what really happened, regardless of the many lives repeated about Vietnam over and over again. So I thank you for having me in your midst as a friend, and a loyal friend, trust me on that, and thank you for hearing me out.